All right, everybody. Happy Thursday. Welcome to another hopefully very who do you mute? Let's mute some people. Hopefully a very engaging and learning session. Today's topic, Florida residential disclosure updates. Florida residential disclosure updates. We're going to discuss the whole disclosures in general as well as some updates to our disclosure requirements. All right. So for those who I've had not had opportunity to meet, we have a lot of familiar faces, but we always have new faces in the room. I always like to not assume. I did that before, and I was like, I just assume that everybody knows me, and that's not right, and that's not cool, right? So for the new folks in the room, welcome to Purchase Ready Lab, our Thursday gathering. My name is Ray Cole Jackson. I'm a South Florida real estate attorney. A little bit about me personally, and you'll learn more about me as we gather each week. But professionally, I am a real estate attorney. I own and operate a title company, mortgage brokerage, licensed real estate professional. Um, we also provide transaction coordination services, all the things. Me personally, my background, I am originally from South Florida. I attended the University of Florida. I always put that out there for any Seminoles that might be in the room, agitate them. So I always say, go Gators. Came back home to Miami, got my LLM in real property development. And like I mentioned, I am a licensed Florida real estate sales professional and loan officer. And so when we come together each week and have these conversations, the intent and the goal is to make sure that we have a holistic, a 360-degree conversation about whatever particular topic, right? Because one thing I want to make sure that you all are always aware of is that your business is holistic, right? Um, meaning we can be talking about, as you'll see today, we're going to be specifically talking about disclosures, but there's somewhere in the contract, even though we're talking about a disclosure form, there's somewhere in the contract that also that discusses disclosures, right? And then, for example, we talk about lending. I mean, we may talk about VA lending or FHA lending. We may be talking about that framework in general, but we need to always remember that there's a rider that we should include in our transactions or in our contract documents when we are discussing or when we have a client that is obtaining FHA or VA financing. Does that make sense? And so the point is, when we come in on Thursdays, we always come in with a target, but buckle up your seats and keep your eyes open and your ears tuned in because we may make a turn. Because again, we want to be we want transaction mastery, right? We want to understand the transaction holistically, right? And we don't want any blind spots. So that's always our goal, right? Um, Handout. Go ahead, grab the handout, purchaserelabhandout.com. If you go to purchaserelabhandout.com, you'll grab our handout for today before we get into our discussion. So purchaserelabhandout.com. All right. You can use the QR code or drop that link in the chat. I mean, or drop that domain in your browser. All right. All right. So I need to do not disturb. So the seller's duty to disclose, taking it a step back. Thank you, Sophia. Taking it a step back, and just let's talk about the foundation of the seller's duty to disclose. The seller's duty to disclose is founded in the 1985 Supreme Court case, Johnson v. Davis. And what came from that case is the court said that a home seller who knows about facts that materially affect value and that are not readily observable, that's the trigger, readily observable and not known to the buyer, the seller has a duty to disclose them. Readily observable, meaning you know that there is a massive hole in the floor under but it is under this beautiful Persian rug that's also under a beautiful dining room table that coincidentally the seller is allowing to be purchased along with the prop with the house. Coincidentally, right? And so uh Doreen, she goes to the listing appointment. And so we're sitting at said table. We're sitting at said table, um, that is over said massive hole, and we're signing the listing agreement the old school way. And so Doreen has her pen, and her pen falls off the table and goes under rolls under the table. And she goes to grab the pen, and the seller said, hold on, hold on, Doreen." Wait a minute. I have a grabber for that. You don't want to crawl onto this rug under this table. You might go through the floor. And DeRay says, I might go through the floor. What do you mean I might go through the floor? Oh, nothing. Just a little pesky little hole. Somehow, I don't know. It started off small and it got large, but don't worry. Like nobody knows. See, you didn't even know. You're sitting right here. You had no idea. You had no idea, right? We've done a good job. This rug, it's great. We paid $1,000 for it. This table is amazing. Just just let me grab the pen and let me sign and let's get this thing sold, right? Wrong. That is exactly what's not readily observable because when the inspector comes, I don't care how many inspector comes, how many of them are going to move the table and move the rug to identify that there is a hole in the floor? They're not. That's what this case is based on. That's not readily observable. Oh, and by the way, we're going to talk about this a little further. Doreen, Sophia, Judy, Jocelyn, you're on notice now. You have a duty to disclose as a realtor because you know about this hole that's not readily observable. All right. So in that's the seller's duty to disclose in general when it comes to the condition of the property. Even though it's an as-is contract, you have a duty to disclose known facts about the property that materially affect the value that are not readily observable and not known to the buyer. You have a duty to disclose that. So that is the backbone of our seller disclosure rules, right? So let's talk about disclosure in general. Let's define disclosure. It is the formal act of revealing material facts such as property defects, financial assets, or risks to ensure transparency. It is the formal act of revealing material facts such as property defects, financial assets, or risks to ensure transparency. Again, the golden rule is the seller must disclose facts that materially affect value that are not readily observable, right? And not known to the buyer. And so this graphic again is just a visual that shows you that our modern day disclosure rules, they're built on this Supreme Court case. Everything right is built on the fact that in 1985 the court said you have to tell seller, you have to tell buyers about issues with this property that they would not know. There's no way for them to know that, right? And you have that duty. You have a legal requirement to do that. So let's talk about the seller's property disclosure in general. This should not be new to anyone per se. And I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't say that. That's not nice because we could have new realtors. We could have folks that just became licensed and just started practicing. So by show of hands in or drop a one in the chat if you've never worked with the seller's property disclosure. And that's fine if you've never used it. That's fine. And I'll tell you a reason why in a second that you've never used it. Familiar with it? We need to have a conversation. But never used it is fine. Okay, great. So everybody has seen the or worked with the seller's property disclosure before, and I've not made a comment that has scared you off and made you not want to be transparent. But in any event, the seller's property disclosure has been around for a very long time. Oh, we got a little bit of overlay here. So one thing that this says, and I'm just gonna leave here, I'm not gonna pop out. This form is not required. It is not required. It is not required. I'm going to say that again. The form is not required by law. Your brokerage may have a requirement. Your, and we're going to talk about if it becomes a part of the contract, but the form in and of itself is not a required form. I see your question, Terry. Not required. No. Mm-mm. The legal requirement is only disclosure. It's only disclosure. And so and it's not even necessarily the exact form, it's just disclosure. And one thing I put a note in here is paragraph 10J of your as is contract. It discusses disclosure. It discusses disclosure. So if you were to proceed in a transaction and not use this form, that still does not negate the seller's responsibility to disclose known facts that they know of that materially affect the property. Again, just because this form has not been executed does not absolve the seller of disclosing material facts that are not readily observable that the buyer should know about, because this language is built into the purchase and sale contract at paragraph 10J. All right. All right. Now, this one has a little bit of overlay too. The parties can make the disclosure for that particular form required. I am fighting not to close out and fix this really quickly. The parties can make the written seller disclosure form required by utilizing the property disclosure addendum, and that's in your handout. In your handout is the disclosure, the two forms of disclosure, as well as the addendum. The addendum, when it is attached to your offer, is what makes that seller's disclosure a requirement. Are we clear on that? At the outset, the seller's disclosure form by itself is not a legal requirement. If your brokerage requires it, you need to ensure that, for example, if you represent the buyer, if you know that your brokerage requires it, then guess what that means? That means that the property disclosure addendum is a requirement for your brokerage, because otherwise you have no means of forcing or requiring a seller to execute the disclosure. Are we clear on that? If we're not clear, say not clear. Okay? And then the
Repeat that
language
again,
goes
Ms.
on.
Rico.
Go ahead.
I just want to make sure we're clear on that. Can you repeat what you just said, please?
The seller's disclosure form is not required. The form in and of itself is not a required form. The seller must disclose, again, material defects to the property that are not readily observable. That's built into the contract at paragraph 10J, but they're not required to use the form. They become required to use the form when, for example, you use the property disclosure addendum, because in that addendum, they specifically agree that they are going to provide the disclosure within 3 days. And then the buyer has a review time period where they must review the disclosure. And then they decide whether or not they want to proceed with the property based upon the information that has been disclosed in the disclosure form. If they do not, then they need to cancel,
Thank you.
right? So I want to say this again, just so that we're clear, because this issue comes up very commonly, frequently regarding this seller's disclosure. Seller has a duty to disclose material defects or issues with the property that affect value, right? Condition that are not readily observable. That's based upon Supreme Court case law. We start there. They have a duty to disclose. The form itself is not required by law. Your brokerage may require it. If your brokerage requires it for compliance reason and you represent the buyer, then you want to make sure that you layer on the disclosure addendum, because you put that addendum with your offer, because once the seller signs that addendum, now they've obligated themselves to complete that seller's disclosure within 3 days. That's the language within the addendum form, giving the buyer then the opportunity to review the information provided and cancel the contract within 3 days after reviewing the disclosure, the information that's disclosed in the seller's disclosure. All right. So that's the seller's disclosure framework, right? In general. Now, when it comes to execution of the seller's disclosure, I will admit it's a bit lengthy, small font, single line spacing, but buyers are making a very large investment, right? And they've already executed an as is contract. So it is only fair that they are able to gather as much information about the um, property as possible. Did not realize that there was an addendum. Yeah, there's an addendum for a lot of things. It always reminds me of the old commercial. There's an app for that. There's an addendum for that. So yes, there is an addendum. Now, when it comes to executing the seller's disclosure, here are some points to remember. One, only the seller completes the form. You do not complete this form for the seller. These representations are made by the seller alone, right? It's based on the seller's actual knowledge. They don't have to guess. If they don't know, they don't know. That's a valid and safe answer, right? Because the buyer's still going to have to perform their own due diligence. The seller's disclosure is not a replacement for the buyer doing conducting their own inspection. Go ahead, Jocelyn.
What if English is the seller's second language? So,
That's a very good question. That's a very good question. They would need to have it interpreted, right? They would need to have it interpreted because we don't have it in I don't even know that I don't think we have it in Spanish yet. I'm not sure. I don't think we have it in Spanish yet, but I know we definitely don't have it in other languages. Yeah. So if you speak the language, you can interpret it. Of course, not necessarily explain it, just word for word translation. Translation, I guess, is the word that I should use. Just translate it. Or even safer, require that they work with it, get it completed with someone that they trust, right? Family member, friend, daughter, cousin, son, whomever understands, speaks their native language and can translate the form for them. So that's a very good question, Jocelyn. Um, Again, the disclosure is not a warranty, right? It never replaces an independent inspection by the buyer. And the obligation to disclose is ongoing. This is important. This is similar to the purchase and sale contract where it provides that the property must remain in its as is condition as of the time of going under when you went under contract, right? I always use the example for you guys that, when you went under contract, the pool was blue and the grass was green. Well, we now closed and now the pool is green and the grass is black. Like, what do we no. No. Everything is supposed to remain static from the time we go under contract. So similarly, if using our same hypothetical when we started, there wasn't a hole in the floor, Durain's seller didn't know about a hole in the floor. Well, all of a sudden, between contract and closing, we find out that this, the table is not staying. The Persian rug is not staying. So in her move out, when she's preparing to move and pull the rug up, and there's a hole in the floor. Oh my gosh. We have to disclose that, right? So the seller must immediately update the buyer if any answers become inaccurate prior to closing. All right. All right. So there is a form that is different from residential versus condominium disclosure. That's in your handout. High level, some of the major risk, right, that are disclosed in the residential versus the condo disclosure. When we look at residential, we're looking more at the property itself, right? So structural issues, leaks, termites, roof history, even HOA restrictions, zoning, and permits. But when we come to the condo market, we're looking at more financial risk, right? The milestone inspection, structural integrity, the association documents, pending special assessments. Those are big numbers. With the condo property, you can run into some big numbers that can create a problem for the buyers. And so you want to make sure that that disclosure um, is exposed. And so we know that, yes, of course, with the unfortunate issue with Surfside, we know that there are potential structural issues, but more importantly, most commonly, it's going to be financial risk with condos as requirements come through to shore up the the reserves for condo associations and the structural integrity of the properties, right? So those are the key disclosures. Now, so that's the disclosure. The seller's disclosure, again, is something that we commonly utilize. You guys obviously learned the some of the nuances around the seller's disclosure that you've been using for a while. The update disclosure is the flood disclosure. The flood disclosure. You guys have probably heard about the flood disclosure. Now, I feel like this one kind of quietly came out because this one came out actually in October 25. And I feel like it was kind of quiet because I don't see it. I don't see it in y'all's contract packages. But this is a required disclosure. It does require a separate a flood disclosure to be completed and provided to the purchaser at or before contract execution. This one is statutory. This one is statutory. And again, I'm not seeing it. And we get a lot of documents when contracts are sent in for closing, and this disclosure is not one of them. I'm not sure if maybe your brokerages are on the back end. You're sending it on the back end, but just keep this in mind, guys, that this is a required disclosure. The handout, Peter, is purchase ready lab handout.com. We now have a standing link. All right. So I wanted to just use as a point of reference. You're welcome. I wanted to use as a point of reference. Recall we have the lead-based paint disclosure. That's a common one, right? That one's on our exam. Lead-based paint disclosure, and that's for properties built prior to 1978 that requires the seller to disclose of any known lead-based paint issues. That was still there, right? That's also a required disclosure. That one has not gone away. But that's actually just to give you guys a little bit of a comparison. That's a federal law requirement, right? So the flood disclosure is from our state statute update, and the longstanding lead-based paint is a federal requirement. So many of you, you're probably thinking in your head as we're going through this, checklist update. Yeah, you should be, right? Next week's conversation is the checklist. You should be thinking, oh, checklist. Like this was not part of my checklist of documents to be prepared or provided by the seller when I go under contract. So the again, the shift regarding the flood disclosure came in October 2025, and again, I feel like it's been pretty quiet. But the update is the form previously asked about federal assistance, federal flood assistance regarding a recovery regarding a potential flood or an experienced flood at the property, right? And so that was, FEMA or some charitable assistance, but now it has been expanded. It's just assistance in general, right? So before it was just if you receive federal assistance. Now, if you receive any assistance, if the seller has received any assistance in general regarding a flood, that has to be disclosed. That has to be disclosed. And again, this is on every transaction, right? Right. Now, as it relates to leases, the landlord also has to disclose regarding leases. If the lease is 1 year or longer, that must be disclosed by the landlord. So you have to use the flood disclosure if you're in a leasing transaction and it's going to be for 1 year or longer. The consequence of not providing this disclosure is the tenant can potentially terminate the lease. It can terminate the lease. Go ahead, Sophia.
Good afternoon. Yeah, I
Hey.
recently had a lease and the realtor for the landlord, he provided the disclosure, the flood disclosure, but he wanted my tenants to sign. There's no way for it. There, it only shows landlord signing, so I just had them sign it regardless. But does that matter?
Yep, and we're gonna talk about that. He's sharp.
Okay.
He did good. That was good.
Okay.
Very good question. Yes, ma'am. Um, he did the right thing. So we're actually gonna talk about that in a couple slides.
Okay.
So this disclosure, and thanks so much for asking that. This disclosure must be provided at or before the rental agreement is executed. Signing it after the fact is too late. You're supposed to sign it at or before execution of the lease, right? And the form is essentially identical to the seller's form. It's just again providing a disclosure as to any assistance or relief that the landlord received related to the property. All right. So again, just to reiterate, mandatory for residential leases 1 year or longer. It's before or at the time the lease is executed. Providing the information after the fact is non-compliant, and the risk is that the tenant could potentially terminate the lease. Now, to Sophia's question, only the signature of the seller and the landlord is required on the form. All right, so this is a comparison on the screen for you guys. So what triggers the requirement to disclose the flood disclosure? For a purchase and sale, is that the property being sold, of course. And then for residential leasing, is for a lease of more than a year. Timing, at or before contract execution. So what does that mean? That means it should be included with an accepted offer, right? With the lease. It should be included at or before the time that the lease is executed. We just talked about the signature is only required of the landlord and only of the tenant. I see your question, Della. Give me 1 second. We'll answer questions at the end. And then the penalty for non-compliance are pretty significant. For in a purchase and sale transaction, there could be litigation. There could be litigation. And in the again, as I indicated before, in a leasing transaction, the tenant could potentially terminate the lease. They could potentially terminate. So, to Sophia's question, the forms do not require buyer signature, but best case scenario or best practice is for you to have the buyer sign as that as that listing agent did. Yeah. So by law, the buyer and tenants are not required to sign the updated flood disclosure. The forms intentionally omit the recipient disclosure. I'm sorry, signature lines, but the absence of a signature can create a question as to whether or not it was timely provided or if it was provided at all. And so again, I'm glad Sophia asked the question. As that listing agent did, it's best to have it countersigned by the buyer, right? All right. So, in a nutshell, high level disclosure, disclosure, legal requirement. It is a legal requirement. We cannot act like we don't know, again, that there is a hole in the floor. We can't because there are consequences of that, right? And so now we know as realtors, because you're going to have a conversation. And again, most sellers are going to look at that form and say, what, what, what is this? 10 pages, 8-point font, single space. I don't know. Right? But now you'll be able to confidently say, well, the basis of this is a Supreme Court case that requires a seller to disclose non-observable material facts that impact the value of the property. Just as a general matter, you as a seller, you must disclose issues with the property that a buyer cannot readily identify. This particular form is the form that we use in practice to make those disclosures. Well, why do I have to do this? Well, the reason you have to do it is because within the offer that was provided, the seller, you're going to explain to this, you would explain to the seller that this is what you're agreeing to with this particular addendum. All right. Don't just send off any. I'm going to assume we're not just sending a package to our offer package to our customers without explaining to them what they're signing, right? Right. All right. So when that if that assuming that addendum, that disclosure addendum is included in the offer package, you're going to be able to explain to them this is the basis of this addendum. This is what this addendum explains. If you don't know, you simply don't know. Your only obligation is to disclose what you do know. You're not providing them with any warranty. This is still an as-is contract. The buyer still has an obligation to conduct their own inspections. All right. And then again, as it relates to the flood, we know that that is now required for purchase and sale, and also required for leases that are more than a year, that are a year or more. And we know that it needs to be at the time of execution of the lease or the contract. Buyer's signature, tenant's signature is not required. However, best practice is to have that executed. Non-compliance consequences are pretty significant, pretty significant, pretty significant. Litigation or termination of the lease, right? In both cases, we're talking about potentially money damages, right? Because if the tenant terminates the lease, now I have to find another tenant. I've disrupted my cash flow. All right. All right. That wasn't too difficult. So let's talk about it. Let's see these questions in the chat. It says in your entire career. Well, hey, we're further away from lead-based paint, so that's another reason why you don't see it as commonly, but the requirement has not changed. Um, Della, good question. What if you have a tenant but the listing agent didn't send you the disclosure? Do you send it to the agent? No, but you ask them about it if you want to be nice. I mean, your tenant wants to know. So you say, "Hey, I think we're missing the flood disclosure." All right? And they'll thank you for that. Um, Kevin, good question. If it's why don't we require the tenant signature? Well, if I were to pontificate, because it is necessary for you should have both sign. But just I definitely have to update my package. What's up, Jay? The you should, I would say you should want to have the buyer sign, but what's most important is the seller's disclosure, right? I must tell you about it. So I agree, Kevin. It should definitely be there, but it isn't. Maybe in the next update it'll be there. Um, if a condo is on the second floor, is it still needed? Yes, you're selling. Yes, there's no carve outs for um what level the property's on. If you're selling residential property, you have to provide the disclosure. All right. You're welcome. Any other questions? This one wasn't too hard, right? Wasn't too hard. I know the first part of it was probably like, what? I never knew it wasn't required because some realtors operate as if it is legally required, and it is not. It is not. The general seller's disclosure is not required. Um, all right. All right. So remember, if you're not receiving text updates, scan the QR code so that you can get your text updates. Um, and make sure that you put in a number. I think you're gonna have to, no, I'm almost positive you're gonna have to check the box um, to allow for receiving the message. All
I
right.
recall.
Hey,
Hi, there was a question earlier that I did not ask, but I really would like the answer. If
okay.
if there was a murder or a death in the property, are you
No,
supposed to disclose that?
no,
You don't have to disclose that. And
no.
then in the lead paint, if like most of us, all the time we say that nobody knows about lead paint, and then it says that you're supposed to send a pamphlet that's available online. So are you actually supposed to email that a copy of the link to the pamphlet?
It's funny. When I teach the contract class, I tell that joke all the time. Yeah, they are supposed to receive it. The buyer is supposed to receive it. Um, I say that joke all the time. Um, the there's also the energy brochure, paragraph 10. So paragraph 10 of your purchase and sale contract um is all your disclosures. I call it your be it known section. And so 10E says that the buyer has gotten an energy brochure, and 10F is your lead-based paint disclosure. So, yes, they should be receiving it. How often is it provided? I get some agents that say yes. They say that it's in their brokerage's portal, and they make sure that the buyers get it every time. But that is within built into the contract that when the buyer signs it, they're agreeing that they've received it.
Okay.
So
And
that's a
you
very good
can,
question.
and really you can send it to their agent and then I guess their agent should send it to their client.
Right, but the buyer's one, that's the I'm sorry, the energy efficiency, the buyer's agent should be providing that. That's not a seller's duty to provide.
Yeah. I'm
Right.
talking to you about the silly pamphlet.
Right.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
All right. All right. Kevin, these have not been uploaded to the school platform. They are now on YouTube. And so we send out the link. So if you go to the Purchase Ready Lab page on YouTube, they are all there. Um, and so they'll be housed there. All right. We are transitioning off the school platform just because we are building out a platform that allows for just has a little bit more robust features. All right. All right. And yeah, we didn't do too bad. 12:41. All right. You guys get the rest of your you guys get the rest of your day back. Um, and we are getting out of here. Susan, we're leaving. All right. Any other questions? You're welcome. Any other questions?
Thank
Thank you very much.
you.
Not a problem.